Robin Hood Radio welcomes you to David Freeman's Science Insider with your host, the senior science editor of the Huffington Post, David Freeman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today I'm speaking with Simon Head. He's the senior fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University and the director of programs for the New York Review of Books Foundation. He's also the author of a new book called Mindless: Why Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans. It's a fascinating book, which is why I've invited him here. It's also a bit frightening because it puts a spotlight on a rather dark side of the continuing computer revolution. In the book, he talks about computer business systems, which are a technology that is really revolutionizing the lives of workers and consumers. So welcome, Simon.
A pleasure to be with you.
So what exactly are computer business systems, and what are they doing to us?
These are very complex information systems. We often think of information systems as single items of technology. We think of the laptop, we think of the desktop, we think of the mainframe, we think of these individual objects of technology. But what these computer business systems, are many technologies brought together to perform a very complex task. And there's a precedent for that, which is actually very relevant, which is what Henry Ford did with his great plants a century ago. He pulled together all kinds of engineering technologies to do something very complex, which is to make a car from beginning to end. And that's a very fruitful way of thinking of these systems. They are brought together really to manage whole corporations.
And of course, that had a big benefit in some sense for consumers. It made these products much less expensive, and presumably that continues today. But you say there's also a very kind of a downside, a very dangerous downside to the spread of the use of these technologies.
Right. I think you have to think very much in historical terms, which economists tend not to do. But the historical perspective is very fruitful when you're looking at the historical roots of these systems, because Ford was a huge landmark in really the development of mass production systems. And they have a very remarkable record in American history. I mean, think of the Second World War. We won the war thanks to FDR's arsenal of democracy, which was a massive application of mass production to the production of armaments. And then think of the conversion of the wartime economy to the civilian economy after the Second World War, which gave us a kind of golden age of American consumerism. What we've now had in the last 20 years are these systems crossing over from the manufacturing industrial sector into the service economy. And there too, there's been success, which adds to the momentum of these systems. If you think of Amazon and Walmart, they are really sort of a kind of industrialized service corporation. But in purely productivity terms, the application of these mass production methods has been immensely successful. So what we're now seeing, and what I'm really interested in, is the application of these methods to real services. When humans interact in healthcare, financial services, so-called human resource management, customer relations management, and so forth. And it's in these areas that I think these systems do not work, and where the attempt to industrialize them leads to lousy service.
Well, but going back to Henry Ford, to the Ford plants a century ago, the idea was to create a vehicle by distributing these tasks, these work tasks, to a big number of people. So it reduced the level of skill needed to help put the car together. One person can twist bolts all day. How does that play out in a company like Amazon, say, or Walmart?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very good point. And that's why history is so important, because I would argue that in American business history, there is a bias, of course, towards mass production, but also a bias towards the simplification of tasks, which is essential for mass production. Mass production is about standardization and speed. So, skill, the elaborate performing of difficult tasks, isn't really part of that. And I would argue that this tradition of simplification is crossing over into these service areas and what I call core services, where humans are interacting with one another. And you see this every day in call centers, which are really quite complex because we're dealing with each other. But again and again, you get this rather surreal feeling that the person at the other end of the 1-800 number isn't asking real questions. They're asking questions from a digital script, as indeed they are.
Right.
And the questions they asked doesn't really depend on what we say. And this is an example of dumbing down skill in the interest of cutting costs, less skilled workers, and speeding things up. And I think it leads to disastrous services.
Well, so from the consumer's point of view, clearly it may not be as much fun to talk to a machine or to someone who is parroting a script that's been written for him or her. From the worker's perspective, I know that you talk about this in your book, that the workers, say, on an Amazon floor, a warehouse, or at a Walmart facility, their activities are controlled down almost to the second by these computer monitors. Is that right? How exactly does that work?
Yes. Well, this is, I would say that Amazon and Walmart are really industrial companies because the workplace relationship is between the worker on the floor at Amazon, so-called fulfillment center, and a Walmart store. The relationship is between the worker and objects, in other words, goods, which has to be shipped. So what we were talking about a minute ago is relations between humans, which is not industrial in the same way. But you're absolutely right that in this industrial relationship between, let us say, Amazon workers and the packages, Amazon has pushed worker productivity really to the point of that they're being able to cope and beyond. They've just pushed the pressure of the systems through these targeting and timing systems so that older workers, people over 40, find it very difficult to do.
And is this part of, but again, what's the experience for the worker? Is to be photographed, to be on video, to be, how do they keep track? You talk in the book about people being represented by icons on a computer screen that managers look at. What exactly?
That can happen. I would say, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which I don't associate with hard-hitting investigative journalism, did last fall in November have a terrific program when they managed to get somebody into a Amazon depot in Wales in the UK, and they also managed to get in a camera. They had a clandestine camera attached to this person, and what this person also had was the onboard computer, a tagging system, which told the worker his route to follow from the unpacking place to the shelf, but also gives him the time that he's got to do it.
Right.
And what one saw in this program was what happens when the worker is behind and the thing starts beeping. To me, that was the workplace of hell, and particularly for some reason the lights failed on one of these occasions where the wretched worker was about 5 seconds behind. He was in the dark. He was rushing to try and get to his destination in time. He didn't make it. And when he got there was some kind of nerdy overseeing guy who said, you haven't made your time. You'll get a demerit if you go on like this. And of course, if you get 3 or 4 demerits, you're out.
So but let's go back a bit. So because someone might say, well, yeah, we've been hearing about the oppression of workers since Marx and before that, going back to the Luddites, I guess, who in the early part of the 19th century were complaining about. Well, you tell us about the Luddites and how is there a connection between that kind of thinking and what you're talking about?
The Luddites smashed the system, which is rather counterproductive. You can say that these systems at Amazon and Walmart are efficient. There's no doubt about it. The question is, do the workers have any say at all in how they're used? And there's a very interesting case history. There's the case histories from the US and the UK, where workers have absolutely no influence. There's the case history from Germany, where the whole political economy is quite different, where the position of the workforce and unions are much stronger, and where the politicians, the class politique, is much more closely aligned with Labour than it is here or in the UK. And what's going on right now is an attempt by the service unions called Verdi to organise the Amazon workforce. And what they want to do is to negotiate with Amazon, so that the ways in which these technologies are used are more favorable to workers. And you don't have this, frankly, exploitative, ruthless system driving people to the limits and beyond. And I absolutely support the Amazon workers in Germany and what they're doing.
But again, so is there a trade-off, though, between, I mean, these computer systems, and I guess big data is a part of this as well, being able to amass huge amounts of data on workflows at different facilities. Is there a trade-off between, say, the cost of goods to consumers and the exploitation of workers? I guess there is, right? We're getting goods at cheaper and cheaper and cheaper costs, it seems. So that's clearly an upside.
Yeah.
You also mentioned the upside of being able to do things like win wars, to kind of control all, use these computer business systems to control, to examine threats and to respond appropriately.
Yeah.
So
there is a trade-off. I got into an argument by proxy I wrote a piece about Walmart for the New York Review of Books, and Jason Furman, who I got to know on the Kerry campaign, who now is the chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors as the President Obama. My argument, and it applies equally well to Amazon, is that you have to, as you say, weigh what you're gaining in productivity and convenience to the customer by having the Amazon package delivered overnight rather cheaply, and the pain and exploitation that you're inflicting on the workforce. And I'm saying, and it's a moral judgment, it's not a scientific judgment, that we should not treat people this way in the interest of very marginal advantages to the consumer. And what Jason Furman was arguing, apropos of Walmart, is that we should. He said that the convenience to people in having lower prices at Walmart outweighs the, in my view, ruthless exploitation of the Walmart workforce. Now, that's an ethical, moral judgment, dispute between us. It's not, it can't be settled scientifically.
Well, but another thing you mentioned in the book is the way in which, and this is not brand new, but doctors' prescribing habits, for instance, are overseen. A doctor chooses to do X versus Y, and the health maintenance organization or whatever insurance company that might be flagged via computer. That would occasion a call or an intervention by the insurer. Now, in some cases, clearly the doctor wants it. It's good to have leeway. On the other hand, there may be ways in which aren't people, say, within healthcare, patients being given better treatment as a result of these big computer systems?
I don't think so. And I think the more complex the illness, the more dysfunctional these automated treatment decision-making software is. And I think it's certainly true that you have a syndrome in American medicine of doctors prescribing too many tests and too many alternative treatment, but it has to do with the whole litigation culture and doctors protecting themselves against being sued by patients, and that has to be dealt with. But that isn't really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is HMOs coming up with really false expert systems which are biased in favor of standard, cheaper treatments.
So, talking about these expert systems, that's kind of a key component of this idea that the expertise of various experts is encoded into computer programs, which then controls the behavior of other groups of people.
Yeah.
Seems like a great idea, right? To me.
It's a fundamental issue in this whole area. And some of the key research on this was done at a remarkable institution called Xerox PARC in the 1990s. It was unique because it was an extremely radical, progressive think tank which was attached to Xerox Corporation. It wasn't on its own. It was an organic part of Xerox. It had some extremely original thinkers. The most important was a social anthropologist called Lucy Suchman, and her key concept was what you call situated actions. And situated actions are actions and transactions which are embedded in the rich variety of human life. And it applies even with something like a call center. Again and again in call centers, you find that the situation is defined by the extreme complexity of the transaction.
Well, let me say, so your call centers. You in the book you talk about your own experience with a computer problem.
That's
Is that
right.
the kind of thing you're talking about? You call up to get some help from a corporation with a piece of hardware or something.
Yeah.
And instead of being given to an expert,
Yeah.
you're given someone who was reading the script, which was created.
Well, no, what was unique about that is that I had two teams online at the same time. I had, on the telephone, I had a Microsoft team which was highly skilled, and I had a Toshiba team which was operating according to these Taylorist principles, and the Microsoft team knew about the operating system, Windows XP, completely. I mean, they had a backup expert system. They simply didn't need to use it. They had complete mastery, and they were extremely good at questioning and listening to what I had to say. But the Toshiba people were there because we had a hardware problem too, and they were an example of the application of Taylorism and scientific management to this actually rather complex situation, in which case the database was actually an expert system.
Right.
They didn't rely on their own knowledge to undertake a line of questioning. They had to refer back to the expert system. And so it was an example of what we've already talked about, this kind of surreal questioning, which is slightly off the mark. And it was a very dramatic example of what I'm talking about.
Right, and I think everyone has had that experience these days in trying to get help from someone who doesn't really know.
That's right.
Whenever you go into a store or
That's
on the
right.
phone, you're trying to find the person who actually does know something.
Yeah, and what they're trying to do is, in the interest of cheap labor, there's the hubris of thinking that you can rely on these computer business systems and expert systems to close the gap between the necessary level of skill and what you actually have with a rather unskilled person. But it's a profound fallacy, in my view, that you can do it.
So you just made a couple of references to Taylorism, which means Frederick Taylor, who I guess is kind of the father of scientific management.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about him?
I would say that Taylor is the most influential figure of modern times.
And when was he around?
His heyday was from the 1880s to his death in 1916. I think we're coming up to the centenary of his death. I wonder if it will be celebrated. But Taylor had an enormous influence on Henry Ford. He had an influence on Lenin and Stalin. He had an influence on Japanese corporatism both before and after the Second World War. He influenced the great arsenal of democracy in the US. He's influencing Chinese corporatism today, and in my view, he has a strong influence on these systems. So that's a pretty formidable record of influence.
But who was he? He was an Englishman? What did he do exactly?
He was American.
He was American.
He was a kind of high-born wasp from Philadelphia. He was a very interesting guy because he was a very distinguished metallurgical engineer. He worked out at the frontier of the technology of the time, improved ways of cutting metal. So he was a seriously brilliant engineer, but he also worked out this system of simplifying labor, of analyzing labor and breaking it down into these minute subtasks and then timing them, seeing which was the fastest way, and putting them together again, and always to de-skill, to have less skilled labor.
Well, again, although I guess de-skill in the sense of the breadth of the skills, but presumably you get to be very, very, very good at that specific skill you're asked to do.
Exactly.
So but I don't know how granular it got. Was, I guess, screwing a bolt, or people are doing things that are very, very simple that don't require.
That's right.
A lot of what we would call skill.
That's right. I mean, how Taylorism works in the context, for example, of financial services and the mortgage machine on Wall Street leading up to the crash is very different to how it works on the Ford assembly line, or indeed in the very primitive work that Taylor himself studied, shoveling sand at the Bethlehem Steel Company. But you can see the same principles at work in contemporary Wall Street, which you saw in the Ford plants 100 years ago. There's a real affinity.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you a couple of points about that. Before we talk about how scientific management works in the world of Wall Street, you also are a senior member of the College of St. Antony's at Oxford in England.
Right.
And you talk in the book about an intrusion of scientific management ideas, I guess, in the academic world as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's slowly.
What happened to you? What's going on?
Well, my own position at Oxford is slightly different because I don't. You have to receive money from the UK government for your research, which I don't do. I have other sources of research, thank goodness. Yes, the British government, from Mrs. Thatcher onwards, has created a kind of academic production regime, and the roots of this are in American management doctrines, which in turn descend from Taylor. Very few academics in the UK know this. They don't know where this, in my view, pernicious system comes from. And it is essentially, as I say, a production regime. You've got to turn out 4 or 5 items of scholarship in a 5-year period. And having to do that introduces all kinds of biases into the system. It militates against really great original scholarship, particularly in the humanities and history, because you can't really fit in great work. I mean, think of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Could it have been done within this sort of production regime? No. We have line managers, believe it or not, at Oxford.
Well, the idea. I think we've all heard this idea of publish
or be damned.
So, but
yeah.
Is that a result? Is that a manifestation of this scientific management?
Yes, it
seems like it could have come at any time. It's been around for a long time. No,
it's a function of this supremacy of managerialism. Now, there's a brilliant piece by an academic at Cambridge, England, called Stefan Carlini. And he said that looking at the European history since the 18th century, there have been periods when certain ideas and archetypes become immensely influential. And he cited the enlightened gentleman of the 18th century and the Enlightenment. He cited the entrepreneur and the empire builder in the 19th century. And what he's saying now is that it's the Weltanschauung, it's the ideal of managerialism and control. And my view is that the supremacy of these ideas right now in the Western world derives from information technology. That's where it comes from. And so the managers and technicians who have the power of inventing and controlling these systems have become immensely powerful. And you even find this in universities. In universities, power has shifted from academics managing their own scholarly lives to academic managers and pure managers imposing these benighted systems on them. And it militates, if you look at the whole complex of criteria, we have to worry about indicators of esteem, we have to worry about the impact factor, if you can get your scholarship referred to on a TV program, the amount of money it can bring in. Scholarship is hedged around by all these managerial indicators which have been imposed upon us in a kind of industrial way. And it destroys, in my strong view, really great work.
Although it's interesting, we're talking about, say, Walmart, for instance. I think you talk about, or maybe it's Amazon, the idea that there's one correct way to pack a package.
Right.
So in addition to controlling the output of the workers, there are, to some extent, it sounds like from what you're writing, that the quality of the work is also enhanced. Leaving aside the moral issues, the quality is also controlled, although it sounds like that's not quite the case in the academic world.
Well, that's right. I think they are similar, but at the same time different. Certainly, I'm prepared to concede that in the case of Amazon, the way the tailorists and the scientific managers figure out how to pack a package may well be the one best way. But the crucial question at Amazon is how much time do you allow the worker for the job? How much pressure is he or she under? And that is a profound, crucial moral question. Now, the situation with the academic production regime at Oxford is slightly different, because it's certainly true that the academic managers and bureaucrats are not dictating to us, this is what you must say. This isn't the Soviet Union. This isn't censorship. But my argument is, by hedging around scholarship with all these non-academic criteria, time targets, quantitative targets, indicators of esteem, impact factor, the amount of money it brings in, you are actually introducing all kinds of biases which militate against the original and the brilliant. and which push people towards a kind of conventional wisdom.
Right. Well, so going back again to the impact of this scientific management on the lives of consumers. We talked that maybe indeed their prices are kept down because of that.
Yes.
You mentioned the frustration of dealing with a call center.
Yes.
What are some of the other ways in which, and we talked about a doctor whose work is overseen by a system which may or may not reinforce the best care. What are some of the other pernicious effects of this scientific management on the lives of a consumer?
Well, I'll tell you one spectacular effect. And it's the emergence of what we call the concierge economy. Because to the extent that what we've been talking about, the mass production of what I call core services involving complex transactions between us, human agents, you degrade them, as we've been discussing, when you apply these Taylorist methods. But if you're a very, very high-income consumer, and there are plenty of them, given the extreme inequalities of income and wealth which are emerging in the US and indeed in the UK. So you've got all these immensely rich consumers. They're not going to put up with this.
Right.
They want something better.
They can opt out.
Exactly. They can opt out. They can use their financial muscle to create what is becoming known as the concierge economy. And the concierge economy is you get terrific service from your doctor. The doctor will give you your own private waiting room. He'll have a dressing gown for you to put on. He'll give you as much time as you like. If you're down in Florida, he'll fly down to see you. I mean, this is going to be...
And you talk about, too, bankers. There are private bankers.
Private bankers.
Private alternatives.
I mean, the Goldman Sachs private bank, they all have them. You don't have to go through the nightmare of the recorded voice, having to listen to option 1 through 10 and then getting the wrong option and having to go back to the beginning, so you've wasted 15 minutes in the maze. You have the direct number to your own private banker, and that banker will be properly trained. That banker will be familiar with your case. He or she will be familiar with all the products. If you want to have a different pension system, you will get terrific service. And that's what the concierge economy does. But there's something profoundly unjust about it, in my view.
Well, it sounds like if you're saying that the workers, it's clear that the workers' wages don't keep up with the increases in productivity, as you point out in the book, and that's clearly the downside, the kind of the two-tier system, the managers versus the workers. Same thing happens, I guess, with consumers, right? You've got the wealthy consumers for whom scientific management is fine. It doesn't matter.
Well, it's not scientific management.
Well, I'm saying that, the effects of that, and again, you're not saying that all scientific management is bad on its face, right? There are appropriate ways to make production lines and similar things in the service economy as efficient as possible, right?
Well, I think there's an important point here. If we look at manufacturing, as I said, scientific management actually had an extraordinary record of success from Ford's time, or even before the end of the 19th century, right through to the 1970s. It begins to decay in the United States in the 70s, early 80s, but then it's renewed by Japanese methods. The Japanese so-called lean production system is really an evolved system of scientific management. But if you look at the German economy, and here again, history is very important. As I said, the history of the role of skills in German industry is rather different. The old guilds had much more influence in Germany than they did in the US or the UK, and you find throughout German history in the 20th century, good and bad, skills have a much greater role. So if you look today at the fact that the Germans dominate all these highly skilled segments of engineering in the most complex machining systems and machine tools, they do it because they've got this very effective system of training workers to a very high level. So if you're stuck in this Taylorist scientific management, there's a limit to what you can do. There's a ceiling to the excellence of the products you can turn out. And if you have this ceiling, you're actually much more vulnerable to low-cost production coming in from China. The Chinese can do this, and the UK in particular suffered deeply from this. If you're higher up the scale, and you're a German or an Austrian or a Swiss German machine tool maker, you're really immune from the Chinese challenge, because they can't do it. They don't have the skill base to do it.
Right. Well, thank you very much. That's a talk for another time, but fascinating talk. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Simon Head, the author of Mindless: Why Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans. Thanks so much for coming.
Pleasure to be with you.
Science Insider with David Freeman, the senior science editor of the Huffington Post, produced in cooperation with Robin Hood Radio, robinhoodradio.com on the web.